I should both warn and maybe oversell this up front, that I have some concern about what I'm going to say as maybe being offensive or tasteless at times. I'm going to try to mitigate that, but it's something that I'm a little bit worried about. One reason for that is that I gave this, the pitch for this talk, when I was sleep deprived in Romania after speaking at the European Testing Conference earlier this year, which was a wonderful conference. It's happening again. Y'all should look into it. And I had a flash of inspiration based on something that one of my colleagues had said to me about why he was considering not renewing his AST membership that year. And this is Dave Liebreich, who has been a member of the AST for a very long time. And unfortunately, I don't know whether or not he is not a member now because of this concern that he had, or if he's not a member now purely because he passed away. Because when I got back from Romania, after sending this pitch in based on something he'd said to confer with him about what he'd meant, on Monday, our vice president of cloud R&D came through the building ringing a bell, and all of Cloud Foundry learned that Dave had died. So I never got to clear this with him. And this is what I'm worried about. Maybe he's a little tasteless. It's like, hey, here's this thing Dave said. Now it's mine. But he said, I'm concerned. I asked him, why are you thinking of maybe not renewing with the AST? He said, I'm concerned that they're perpetuating a harmful divide. And we talked about this a lot. We talked about the issues surrounding it. But that sentence is what stuck with me. And in his absence, it hardened in me a little bit that we should talk about this. The harmful divide in question is the divide between testing and programming, or in some cases, between QA and development. Dave, this isn't a talk entirely about Dave, just so we're clear on that, but Dave spent a lot of his career in testing or QA roles, and he was at a lot of places, and it was not because he was having a great time at those places until he arrived at Pivotal, where we have a rather different model, where we don't have a divide between the roles, where we've worked very hard to keep our feedback loops integrated, and the job of knowing what's going on with the software co-located in a human with the job of making the decisions that require the feedback from the skill of knowing what's going on. I work on Cloud Foundry. Cloud Foundry, as Eric mentioned, is a distributed platform as a service or app deployment container orchestration thing. You can use a variety of words to describe it, but the basic pitch is, here's my source code, run it in the cloud for me, I do not care how. And it's a phrase that came from Onsi, our VP of Cloud Engineering, but I think it very concisely describes what we're trying to do. This is very hard. This is lots of VMs running on arbitrary infrastructures, and arbitrary is maybe a slightly strong word, but we try very hard not to have to care about which IaaS we're running on. We have abstraction layers, we have deployment systems that should mean that it's the same in all these different places, but all of this requires a great deal of testing. And the feedback cycles can be very long because the deployment of a distributed cloud computing system can take half an hour in the ideal case, or hours and hours in the less ideal case, depending on whether or not you're okay with downtime and whether you want to wait for all of the distributed containers to carefully drain and relocate their apps before bringing up the next one, and so on. So there are challenges, and it's very complicated. That's the main thing that the main thing that I like to impress on people about this thing is we have long feedback cycles because we're talking about orchestrating and bringing up and down in synchronization 20 or 30 VMs sometimes. And each of those has software running on them that is developed by different teams and then integrated and released, both as an open source product, a release that people and users throughout the world can in turn deploy on their university or corporate systems, and as a commercial product that we support and have some very large customers who are trying to transform the way they develop software by using this deployment platform. This is not a slide you are supposed to necessarily be able to read. I've spent 2.5, this is my third year working on Cloud Foundry, and I have learned about, I've had to grow in all of these skills. Like I said, you're not necessarily supposed to have to be able to read this, but there's 30-some distinct skills on this list that I did not have or was unaware of when I arrived at Cloud Foundry as an exploratory tester. And I've had, most of these are some, like there's RSpec, you know, a Ruby unit testing framework. There's Capybara. There's Concourse, our CI framework. General things like dependency management is a concept I was utterly unaware of, but it's a big part of my life and something that I think about all the time now. Vim, I know how to quit Vim, and I also know how to not quit Vim immediately. That's how you learn Vim. You learn to quit first in a panic, and then you slowly learn to not quit out of anger every time it comes up. And now I get in other editors, and I want my Vim. Pairing, the notion of continuous delivery, the notion of acceptance criteria, the way that we discuss and clarify and squeeze the ambiguity out of stories when we're doing iteration planning meetings or when we're impromptu pointing stories before starting them if they've come into our iteration outside the normal cadence of plan review of the iteration planning and weekly retrospectives. I learned, to the extent that I've learned all of these things, and also to program, right? I can write Go code and compile useful binaries, both for production and test purposes, and that's a thing I do in my daily work. The course of learning all of these things has also led me to some very important meta-level lessons. I've learned about the absolute essential problem, I think, within software development, which is feedback. Feedback for engineers, when they write a line of code, does that syntax even compile? Does that even make sense? Does that even do anything? If it does compile, does it do what I think it's doing? Are there unintended side effects? Are there second order effects that are outside of my immediate attention that I have to worry about? When I refactor, as an engineer, need to do in order to keep the code maintainable and sane, in order to be able to keep developing this thing, do I break everything because my understanding of the model is incomplete? This type of feedback is kind of the obvious technical stuff we're familiar with of like, okay, there was a code change, did it break? But there's also feedback on longer cycles, feedback loops between other roles. The maintenance of those feedback loops is the most important thing that I've learned to pay attention to at Cloud Foundry. So a lot of what we think of as testing responsibility, I've come to conceive of as the care and feeding of, the maintenance and design of feedback loops. I talked about how complex our system is. And I talked about feedback loops. I'm sort of trying to lay out the groundwork for a general case that's to come. So I'm kind of skipping between the legs of the stool here. But here's another important one. I don't know if y'all have heard of Conways Law. There are various phrasings of it. I picked out one that I liked. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structure of those organizations. I think Noah Sussman rephrased this as a general rule. Software and organizations are self-similar at every level. We think about this a lot at Cloud Foundry. We sometimes refactor our systems by reallocating teams first. We have a distributed modular system, and as we've grown, that's allowed us to have distributed modular teams. It does mean that one of our principal concerns becomes integration, because as great as we can be at test-driven development and at carefully maintaining our API contracts and at deploying everything frequently and integrating as regularly as we can, we don't have an overmind. We have a bunch of systems that talk to each other, that coordinate with each other, that have distinct responsibilities. And our engineering team is organized the same way. We also don't have a cross-cutting QA system. We don't have someone testing this thing, paying attention to the integration, taking ownership for the quality of the whole thing. We do have, of course, people paying attention to this, but we don't have dedicated, allocated engineers whose job it is to think about that concern. The other reason I bring up Conways Law is that I think that one of the important things, in addition to noticing that primacy of feedback loops that has contributed to my view of this tester-developer divide as being harmful, is this. If we make validating the software, finding problems with the software, knowing what's going on with the software, judging the quality of the software, interpreting the usefulness of the software to users, a separate concern from specifying, developing, releasing, correcting, and monitoring the software, how does that end up impacting the software's relationship with other, the relationships within the software structure, I should say? What are the implications to the way we end up thinking about and developing software for having it not be the developer's principal concern that the software is under regular, thorough test? This is another slide that you may or may not actually be able to read. This is a list of the teams, or at least their principal concern of the teams, that I have rotated through over the course of less than 3 years on Cloud Foundry. Again, there's like 13 of them. That may not be an exact count. I've done a long tour of this organization. I've seen teams that have designers because they have some visual element, and we make the profound mistake of believing that designers are mostly associated with graphic user interfaces, a mistake that we're still working to correct. To teams that just have development and just engineers and PMs, and design is principally of APIs and is done as sort of a shared task between these. I've been on some of these teams with my title as exploratory tester, especially towards the beginning of my time at Pivotal. That was my job title. That was why I was hired. Elizabeth Hendrickson brought me on shortly after she brought Dave on as an experiment in adding exploratory testing to the Pivotal way, which is based on the Pivotal Labs process that's been very successful for labs for many years, which does not have an exploratory testing aspect explicitly at all. And I'll get into that a little bit more because the subtitle of the talk, right, is software is the lifeblood. Testing as the lifeblood of software development. So when I say they don't have exploration explicitly, I want to put a lot of weight on explicitly because I see a lot of exploration and a lot of testing in their process. Anyway, when we were hired to supplement that process, Cloud Foundry was a more complex, longer running, riskier thing than a lot of labs projects had been. And this isn't to say all labs projects. They've had some very hairy engagements. But an ongoing software project containing dozens of VMs can use some more exploration maybe than some things. So my early rotations were explicitly as a software tester. As I began to pair more, as I began to have more general knowledge of the system, I found very quickly that I was able to contribute in pairs with software engineers generically. Writing feature code, writing test code, figuring out configuration problems. This was all within bounds of what I was able to contribute to. Now, note that that's not stuff that I would have been able to do on my own. You could not have plopped me down in front of a pairing station and said, Jesse, this API should return all of the organizations that this user is allowed to see. Go ahead and write that for me. But I could sit in a chair next to an engineer who was doing that. And as we wrote the TDD, the unit tests to drive it out, as we went through that red-green refactor cycle of write a failing test, write the simplest thing that could possibly work to make it pass, and then reorganize the code to make it better and more maintainable and repeat, I'm able to contribute to those things. And I think a lot of testers can contribute to those very quickly. Once you can begin to think about algorithms, once you can begin to read code, you don't have to know all the nuances of syntax. You don't have to know all of the vagaries of dependency management or all of the algorithm selection heuristics that engineers have accumulated in order to say, this nested if statement, I've heard those are bad. You can do that pretty rapidly, and in a pair that talks a lot about why we're doing things. And with techniques like strong style pairing, where you, the person who doesn't know what's going on, just type at the highest level you're able to do, where your pair says, okay, let's add a for loop. And you say, huh? And they say, okay, let's say for space. And then the next time, maybe they say, let's add a for loop. You just add a for loop, right? I very rapidly found that I was able to contribute as a software engineer, and now I'm allocated strictly as that. We do not have exploratory testers on our staff anymore. That experiment, for various reasons, including the difficulty of hiring people who were first-class explorers who are also very interested in contributing to production work and willing to relocate to San Francisco and could, at the drop of a hat, perform well on testing a CLI in an interview, we found that it was easier to do it with engineers. And in some ways, this is an issue of if all you have is a hammer, like if all we have is a giant engineering staff, it's a lot easier to do things with engineers. But one of the reasons we have a giant engineering staff, and one of the reasons that it's so flexible, is that we have this culture of pairing, where we are able to bring people with diverse backgrounds and interests in and get senior level code out of them by having them in pairs with senior people until they have just become one. So another angle to this divide that concerns me is something called the safety 2 movement's perspective. There's a safety 1 and a safety 2, and they draw a distinction between them. I think the pithy form is safety 1 is, why do accidents happen? Safety 2 sees how complicated the world is, sees how dangerous the world is, and says, why don't accidents happen all the time? The safety 2 perspective, and this is actually one of my favorite papers of all time. It's like a 18-point paper about complex systems and their failure modes and what we know about them. I highly encourage you to look it up. It'll be in the little tweet digest that I send out of this. It's called How Complex Systems Fail. It's by Richard Irvin Cook, who's interested. He's a doctor and he studies, but he's also been a software manager. And he studies failure in complex systems. So I have a few quotes from this paper that I think lead towards the importance of having developers doing exploratory work. Because especially in a world where developers deploy frequently and have to be able to recover from failure, and especially in a world where operations is an explicit concern of developers, whether it's because of DevOps or just because of stronger relationships between development and operations departments, I think these factors become very important. And there are many others. This is a brief tour building towards a point. I strongly recommend you go check out this paper and the notions of the safety 2 movement generally, because they have brilliant things in there about, for instance, why are safety and quality in tension as concepts? So complex systems are heavily and successfully defended against failure. When we have complex systems, we have people working all the time to create safety within those systems. Complex systems contain changing mixtures of failures with 2 U's, apparently, latent within them. I'm pretty sure that's my error and not in the original paper. So complex systems contain changing mixtures of failure. There is always something broken in a complex system. There is always something not working or performing in degraded mode. But it still works. A complex system is something that can route around a little bit of damage, that can survive a little bit of things being out of whack or being down without total failure. And what exactly is out of whack changes. Human operators have dual roles as producers and as defenders against failure. This one in particular, I want to let sink in for a moment. If your human operators have dual roles as producers and as defenders against failure, but you have separated the responsibility and the skill and the identity of recognizing problems from the identity of producing solutions, how can someone serve this dual role effectively? This is, however, the punchline. Actions at the sharp end resolve all ambiguity. We have processes. We have processes, we have documents, we have playbooks. All of those are ambiguous. We have requirements, we have specs, we have pointing parties, we have acceptance criteria. All of those are ambiguous. If you were worried that you would come to this session and not come away with a new term that you could correct other people about on the internet, let me give you some reassurance. I think that people should be called developers. I think that testers are developers, I think that software engineers are developers, and I think that product managers and designers are developers. I think we should refer to product development teams, and everyone on them are developers. I could shout developers a few times, but I think you can generate your own mental image of that joke. The reason I bring this up in the context of actions at the sharp end resolve ambiguity is because of the etymology of the word develop. It's actually to unfold, to cause to be more open. De-envelope, if you like, develop, right? Develop. We unfold things. We resolve ambiguity in things. Testers resolve ambiguity in what actually happens. We resolve ambiguity in the specs and the requirements. Developers resolve ambiguity in a very literal way. The process of development is the process of steadily, iteratively reducing ambiguity from here's my problem to here's a potential solution to here are the requirements for that solution to here's the particular story we're going to do to here are the tasks within that story that we're going to approach it for, to here is the, here's the failing spec that we can use to track whether or not we're actually resolving, like whether the thing we're doing actually wants this or not, to here is the code that does the thing. Now it might not do it right? Ambiguity, it folds back up as soon as you zoom out a layer. But the moment where you write an algorithm, when you write code, you engage in the magic of computers to very rapidly go from an abstract thing to a concrete thing, and something definitely happens at that point. When you run code, something happens. All ambiguity is resolved at the sharp end. Now, you back off a little bit because ambiguity comes back in as soon as you don't know exactly what happened. And then, other developers who are engaged in empiricism can unfold that again and re-resolve that ambiguity to try and feel comfortable and safe and confident and able to proceed. Failure-free operations require experience with failure. Again, this goes straight to if your developers are actually going to be this complex, adaptive part of your complex system. If your developers are part of how it succeeds and how you respond to failure, how you adapt to changing conditions, you need them to be experienced with failure. My favorite way to become experienced with failure is to create a lot of it or to discover it within the system, mostly by doing exploratory testing. Exploratory testing, again, here's this very clear possible divide, right? One product of exploratory testing is information about problems and concerns. And we can give those back to development teams and they can work with them, right? But another product of exploratory testing is implicit, non-transferred knowledge about how the system works, what it looks like under strain, how you can break it, what the signs of failure are, what the normal mode of operation actually looks like, and all of these other bits of familiarity about failure and normalcy that you need in order to try and effectively create failure-free operations. If you separate this, if developers aren't doing this, if testers are the ones who have all of this knowledge, you are leaving money on the table in terms of being able to approach this ideal of failure-free operations. I've laid this model out in a couple of previous talks, and I want to talk about it a little bit here because ultimately this is how I think about things right now. This is the state of the art of my thinking on the structure of teams. At Pivotal, we have, up on the top there, software engineers. They're at the top because that vertical axis is the implementation to experience axis. And this is an axis that's about perspective. Developers' perspective when they are engaged in software engineering tends to be much closer to the implementation side than to the experience side. In the bottom corners, we have UX and design and product management. They are much more concerned with experience than with implementation. That's where their perspective comes from. Some of them are more concerned with the user experience, and it's explicitly in the name of the UX discipline, though they're often called design. And some of them are more concerned with the business experience. Does this thing meet our requirements? Is this going to work for us? Can we ship it? So each of these has a center of authority, that's the little dot, and then an area of contributory expertise, that's an area that is theirs to provide the principal work for, and then an area of interactional expertise, stuff that we expect them, or an area of concern, I should say. Interactional expertise and concern often map to each other. This is an area where we expect them to be able to interact well, to be able to understand the contributory expertise of the other disciplines that they're working with. This diagram shows a pretty good situation where contributory expertise comes all the way out to the points of authority of the other roles, and interactional expertise and area of concern comes all the way out, almost to touch the area of explicit authority of the other roles. Interactional expertise, I'm just saying these words wrong over and over again. Contributory expertise overlaps, but it doesn't extend deep into the other zone of other roles. So here you have PMs and engineers who, somewhere between experience and implementation, have an effective trading zone where they both have contributory expertise. They can actually pair and both contribute, not just informational contributions, but actual practical contributions. And this is a situation where they're able to provide their own feedback loop. So the reason I bring this up is that if you put a tester in the middle of this relationship, because these zones of contributory expertise, or even maybe the interactional expertise, don't overlap or barely overlap, if you can imagine a different version of this drawing that I should have made but didn't, in which you have to have another dot in between these that has contributory expertise principally over to figuring out whether or not the engineers and the PM communicated successfully. You're adding a second set of bonds, a second set of communications. You're adding unnecessary complexity, and you're making it more difficult for these people to have fast, tight feedback loops that involve actual effective collaboration where they contribute to each other's areas of expertise. This is also, incidentally, how people grow and become huge, because as you have these interactions with people, you're pulled to expand your own areas of understanding to be more and more encompassing of those of others. This is also a place where I think that testers should look at it long and hard, because that little, no, wrong thing. All right, that little dot right there is an area of authority. And this is an important thing to how this works. We have these roles and they're centered on an area of authority. This is what the business experience should be. This is what we should put effort into making. This is how it should come out for us and win. This is what the thing should be, and this is how it should work from a user perspective. This is the interface. This is what the experience of interacting with our system will be. This is how we do it, how we build the thing, how the particular implementation is done, and how we keep ourselves able to deliver on the requirements demanded by the other role. There isn't a place, I don't have a place on this graph where I can put software testers and say, you have an area of authority. Because when you put software testers between these other bonds, when you put them in the middle, or you say they are between the PM and the engineering team to make sure the engineering team gets what they want, they don't actually have any center of authority about the product. All they can tell you is, are you communicating effectively? Are your feedback loops working? And so often they're denied even the authority to do that, right? We have mandates put on us about how we'll test or what we'll test. And I think that one of the things I've learned, both in software and in our broader culture, is that it might do us some good to be more explicitly concerned with systematic structures of power and bias. If you're explicitly structurally concerned with power, software testers don't have a lot of it. But what they do is absolutely fundamental to how all the other roles operate. All of this everything that a developer does is based on testing. They don't know if a line of code works until they test. They don't know what the requirement that they've been handed is until they test. So testing is extremely valuable to all of these other roles, but these other roles, and all of them contain testing. Any one of these is a good target that you can bring your testing skills to and have an unfair advantage in over people who are just starting without those testing skills. But all of these roles have a defined area of authority on the project, and that makes a big difference in respect, in balance, in the diversity of voices that are heard on a system. If we have we have more diversity, I believe, in the testing field than is traditional for other areas of IT, even though we could definitely stand to do better. To the extent that we can migrate into other roles, we bring that diversity that we already have into positions of authority on actual projects where it can do some good instead of just being informational. So I'll conclude on this. I thought that this was Jerry Weinberg. I've seen James Bach and Michael Bolton both quote it, but when I turned to the Googs to find out who said this, the only textual reference I could find was James Bach in his book, Secrets of a Buccaneer Scholar. A tester is somebody who knows that things could be different. That's why I encourage all of us to think about and to understand that things could be different, and that in some places things are different, and that they will be different again tomorrow. Testers, and conversely, all of us are testers, and we all understand that things could be different. All of development is based on the notion that things could be different. That when I write this code, it will make a change, and the product will be different. That when I take these requirements and write them in a story and give them to the team, their understanding of what must be done will be different. Not only will it be different from what it was before, but it will be different from what I think. And I need to be concerned about that and see how much I can bring it into alignment. That's what I got.
Okay, who wants some? Okay. Anyone else? All right, we'll get started. Katrina.
Hey, at the very beginning you said AST are propagating a harmful divide. I felt like you didn't really loop back around and give the rationale for that statement. Could you just clarify?
Sure. I think that we are an explicitly tester-focused organization. And I think that tester comes, as a notion, comes in a capital T and a lowercase t form. We're about QA analysts and exploratory testers and just tester, with a capital T, job roles. Raise your hand if you're a tester. In that sense, that's your job. That represents to me something that we continue to assume. When we say we're the Association for Software Testing, we are not really talking about all that other testing that's going on a lot of the time. And actually, I have seen a lot in this conference that has given me reason to believe that this is changing, and maybe we, myself and Dave, have been more accurate to be frustrated at the pace of change rather than saying, oh, we're perpetuating it. But that's specifically the concern, is testing as a separate conference, as a separate discipline, as something that we recognize as a separate stage and a separate activity, is something that we see a lot in these talks. And he had gotten to a place, and I have gotten to a place, that is sort of post-separation, and it felt like it was right, like it was home.
Sure.
Thank you. So where would you see testing conferences heading? Like, do you think they become part of developer conferences, and are you already seeing that trend?
I would love to see testers going to more developer conferences. I would love to see more developers coming to testing conferences. I would love to see more conferences that are focused explicitly on feedback and quality and don't draw a distinction. I see some of that. And if people have examples of conferences that typify that pattern, I would love to know about it. Tweet me and I will retweet it and maybe I'll go. I'm looking for developer conferences to go to in the future. I've spent a lot of time speaking at testing conferences, and I'll probably continue to address testing conferences. But I think that going and taking these skills and promoting them and the explicit recognition of testing skills within developer mind spaces would be very valuable, and I intend to pursue it.
Okay, I haven't seen the tweet printer go yet. I can hardly believe it. Let's go to Steve.
Okay, thank you. I agree with your thought that testers are really developers or part of the development team. And if you could go back to your triangle slide there, that makes perfect sense to me. But I'm also frightened that I don't see tester up there. It just seems to me that are we a superset or all of the above, or a facilitator of all of the above? I feel like we should be on the map somewhere. So I'm kind of nervous about that.
I hear that, right? And people have careers. People have identities. This is part of what I'm a little bit concerned about, not just tastelessness with using Dave, right? But also with the concern of, and I put a slide very much like this up on the screen when I was at my CAST talk a year ago, and that was explicitly what I was worried about, is going to a testing conference to put up a series of slides that show teams and that don't have testers on them. Except, of course, that they do. That user experience testing, for instance, is very much a design activity. Is very much something that PMs and designers both collaborate on and do independently. Unit testing and automated acceptance testing, the creation and maintenance of CI, pre-delivery testing, are all things that engineers very much do in this structure. They're testers. Testing flows through every development activity. It is the basis of every development activity. Are there spots where if you don't have a tester, you get less testing? Absolutely. I'm not sure how harmful that is. Are there places where if you are a tester and you decide, I am really interested in user experience, usability bugs, accessibility, that set of things, I wonder if I could study design and go move in that direction and have an effective thing to contribute? UX people, especially on the research and the customer interview side, have more powerful usability heuristics and more active testing in that area than I think any of us, well, certainly than I have ever seen outside of that role. And I think it's much more valuable to the process of trying to make something that's valuable for actual people to approach it from that angle. And they do a lot of testing. Also, interestingly, perhaps the thing that is most like what I pictured as testing before I started seeing every part of development as testing, product managers in our process do acceptance testing. When an engineer says, all my tests pass, I understand the acceptance criteria and I think we fulfilled them. I took a look at it and I didn't notice any problems that I didn't think of in advance, and it's run through CI. Is this what you wanted? PM goes and tests it to some degree or another, depending on risk, depending on time. But they do. They go and do exploratory testing around the acceptance criteria and the story as a charter. So I think there are testers in all of these groups. No individual is actually as huge as this, or they are rare and beautiful people like Dave, who are actually as large as this in their area of expertise. These are actually teams of people within that role. And maybe you've got yourself some engineers that are more in this area and more engineers that are more in this area. And the ones that are down here, maybe you call them testers and maybe you don't. But they're helping the engineering role have that area of contributory expertise overlap the way that it needs to. And maybe we find testers who've become PMs. This is a path that I've seen several people take. It's by no means required, but I've seen it. And they make excellent, very detail-oriented, very value-focused, very user-focused, but also very technically competent PMs. And these PMs, because their contributory expertise needs to extend so far into engineering land, they need to be very close to the machine compared to a lot of business owners in a lot of systems. They need those testing skills. So, yeah, I hear you. But there are places to go, and even within this, there might be implicit little testing roles that, some different structures can have. And testers have an unfair advantage in entering any of these roles from their testing background and skills, and people will help you.
Okay, people are pointing at somebody in the crowd. Katrina again? Okay, same thread.
Sorry. So James Buck said, without enduring roles, there are eternal amateurs. And he's speaking about if we don't identify testing as a role, that we accept a shallow amount of skill. And I just wondered if you had a response to that, like testing isn't a thing on here, if it's not a role, are we encouraging kind of shallow testing expertise?
I've heard him say that, and it's one of the risks that I think about, and it's one of the things that I have on constant alert about at Pivotal is, are we encouraging perpetual amateurism in the deep skills of testing, in the deep study of testing? This is part of why I would really like to see more of our traditions as a testing community show up in the traditions and cultures of these other communities. We have explicit language about modeling and risk and heuristics, about defocusing and focusing techniques, about finding value. We have specific translation tricks for words like quality to give them explicit meanings that we can discuss better. Those are all very important. And when I hear about the base level of testing being done by developers in many places, and I've had long conversations with people who touch development organizations who, let's say, are structured differently than this, they desperately need these things. Developers couldn't hold up their end of the bargain in a lot of these organizations without a lot of growth away from amateur testing. I think it's possible that by having testers as a role, we're not so much cultivating a garden of all of this deep expertise as we are preventing that expertise from growing in the roles that become dependent on us for it. I would like to see those techniques and concerns take root and grow in the other roles. And I'm concerned that we protect other roles from learning by intervening and saying, I'll be the headlights, I'll be the eyes, I'll be the epistemic knowledge of this team. For reasons like I was discussing in the section on complexity, and for reasons having to do with power, and for reasons having to do with Conways Law and the structure of the systems that we end up producing based on the structure of our communication systems, I really want that expertise in the other nodes on this graph. I need it there. If it's not there, that's a crisis. So that's my read on that. There is a risk, and we need to be active about it. And educate, like being explicit and naming things helps. And James Bach's work, James and I do not agree on this, but his work has been enormously helpful nonetheless in helping bring the valued traditions of this community into the traditions of these other communities.
Deborah.
Hello. So I follow what you're saying. I've been in the development space as well as in the quality assurance space. And so this makes sense to me. I do also hear the concerns of the others, and that makes sense to me. So one of the things we've been thinking about is quality advocacy. And how does that maturity actually happen within the roles you're showing on the diagram? So because for many years, organizations have become more matrixed and there has been more of a division of those specialties in the engineering space, or in the user experience or product management space, right? And even in the business teams as well as the technical teams, those divisions have occurred. So what is your take on putting quality advocacy and education in that space and using the expertise people have developed in these other teams that have been separate for years to do that?
I can't remember how heavy I hit one of the notes that I was planning earlier on things are changing. Things are being deployed now very differently. We've gone from shelfware to continuously deployed web apps. And from that to shelfware again in apps that can only be deployed through the App Store every 2 weeks. Like we have this modulation back and forth between like how easy it is to recover from problems and how hard it is to deploy again. We've also seen changes in the zeitgeist of development communities. Janice Fraser, you may have heard of her, you may have not. She founded Adaptive Path and Luxor and some other UX-focused startups and consultancies, and she's now works at Pivotal. We were, talking at whiskey night one night, and she told me about the process of UX as a discipline, as a bunch of people crying in the dark, basically, being far outside the mainstream of the concern of design, graphic design, as it might have been called, suddenly being able to come in out of the cold, where design caught up and UX as a separate discipline became a separate concern maybe, but it was suddenly within design. Like design as a field unfurled, and all of the people who had been talking about and thinking about UX for decades got to have their little fist pump of like, see, that's what we've been saying all along. Now you see. But mostly they just got to suddenly be part of a large and effective community that had come to see things that way for whatever reason, for a combination of reasons that is different from field to field. I think we are seeing something like that in software development now and in product management instead of project management. I think there's fallout from Agile. I think that there's DevOps and a spillover from this great wave of user focus and human-centered design and all of that came out of the UX community. That enthusiasm plus the technological change that makes it easier to iterate quickly and deliver reliably, and for some technologies, not all, to automate a great deal more checking than was previously easy to automate, leaves people interested in different things. It leaves people's interest free to focus on, oh, I really need to make this thing right. Or you can be adjacent all of a sudden to all of these people who are really excited about quality for the user and or metrics in the case of DevOps culture, for instance, of like, oh, is this thing accomplishing with users what we hoped it would? And as that focus on quality and users like flows through both from on the technological front and on the cultural front, it becomes a lot easier to bring people into it. And people who are coming into the field for the first time, developers who are coming up in hacking schools or whatever, they're not as experienced as CS grads of years past, but they're also a lot more excited about design, usability, and doing good, nice things for people. I think a lot of people coming into the industry now arrive with the notion that we are doing something to help humans as our principal goal, and that if it doesn't help people, it doesn't work. And they infect organizations with that feeling, and that feeling grows in them as they encounter it for other reasons within the organizations they go to.
Anybody else? All right.
Hey, it's me again.
Hey.
You talked about there being no exploratory testers at Pivotal now. And the reason that you gave for that was around recruitment, primarily, that you couldn't find good people. And I kind of wondered if that was a real reason or kind of a post facto justification for why you don't have it anymore. And I was wondering if you could speak to some other things that were happening that caused that shift.
I think that you're onto something. It's a bit of a blend there. But I guess what I should stress is that we had Elizabeth Hendrickson. Who's heard of Elizabeth Hendrickson? Author of Explore It, keynoted cast. All right. We had Elizabeth Hendrickson as one of our directors of engineering trying to recruit testers. She was not finding good candidates. I tried. I interviewed lots of people. I was not finding good candidates. I found lots of people who I think would be able to do various things, but I did not find a lot of people who were both excited about this, working closely with teams and having to do some programming and needing to grow into having contributory expertise as a software engineer, and who were already at the level of exploration that we required. And this is, I think, what was really hard about recruitment. And I will get to the second part of your question, or what are some other reasons. But one of the things that was really hard about recruitment was that we couldn't just have people who we could plop into this system and say, here is how it's going to be. It's all set up for you. It's all figured out. We have guidance for you. We can do this for engineers. I'm not trying to be demeaning in describing this. We are able to provide this for junior engineers. We were not able to provide this for testers. We needed people who were able to come in and be super excited about exploration and charters and like ambiguity and terminology, and who could really perpetuate and grow the like memes of testing in the organization. And this is very hard to find. And even amongst people who have it, they aren't necessarily super psyched to move to San Francisco and be a junior developer all of a sudden. So that was on the recruitment side. On the other side, at some point, if all you can do is test, if you are a tester and your role on the team is to execute charters, we have an allocations problem. Maybe you could have every team have an explorer or two. Teams tend to have, 2 to 4 pairs of people on them, so that's, 4 to 8 developers. Maybe they could be odd. We did that sometimes, where it would go from being 4 developers to 4 developers plus me, and I would solo a lot, but sometimes I would pair. But if you put someone on there who's not ready to actually contribute to the software engineering process or to ramp up quickly, like Natalie was able to do, into being a software engineer as their principal concern, you have an interesting thing where you're saying, well, regardless of the context of the project, we want to spend 1/6 of our effort on testing. And not the testing that we all, like not all the testing, because a lot of that is embedded in the things other roles do in user interviews and story writing and estimating and clarifying and unit testing and CIing. Not all of that stuff, but explicitly in chartered session-based exploratory testing, we're going to spend 1/6 of all of our effort on that minimum at all times. We found projects where that was useful. We also found that creates a lot of little improvements, small wins that can go in the backlog. Not always what a team wants. Sometimes deep bugs. Sometimes it makes perfect sense. Dave was on a couple of 3-week deep investigations of Linux kernel bugs that were causing our distributed gossip protocol members to not ack each other's keep alive signals, and it was very mysterious, and we got really deep into it with exploration. But it presented a problem because it was sort of a hard pre-allocation of how much engineering effort we should spend on exploration when we don't really want that hard pre-allocation. We want to be able to explore as we need to. Also, frankly, engineering managers don't know what to do with exploratory testers. I wrote my own performance criteria and told my manager what to evaluate me on. Now, Elizabeth was around. She reviewed it, right? This is not, I didn't get to just make stuff up. But I had to spend a lot of time explaining, I was in the organization to teach exploratory testing. I had to teach it to my managers, except when Elizabeth was my manager, which she wasn't always. She isn't now. She's become VP of the data organization instead. She's not around to provide an understanding of that from above. Another thing that Dave told me was that it was enormously refreshing not to have to spend 80% of his time justifying his existence. This is something he'd experienced throughout his entire career. And regression testing, filing testing reports, describing what he'd done, he considered all of this to be time spent principally in justifying his right to be there and contributing to the software project. Once we didn't have a clear executive understanding of the value of an exploratory testing specific role, and we had a lot of compelling arguments for how that value could be realized from within other roles, I began to again experience, if I want to do this, I'm going to have to justify it. If I want to do an exploratory charter because that's mostly what I do, I'm going to have to justify why that's worth it instead of it being understood. As a developer, justifying my exploration is way easier. Moving into a role that has that actual authority, I can say, we need to do this exploration because this engineering team doesn't understand some element of technical complexity within this area that I want to target. I know that as a member of this engineering organization. We must explore it. Or if a PM asks me a question, I can say, here's what I think. And Natalie found an explicit example of this in one of our backlogs when she was preparing for her talk. Or not in a backlog, in the team Slack. Hey, how does X work? We think it works this way. If you're worried about it, write us a charter, and we'll explore, and we'll give you the real complete answer. So much easier to do exploration on those terms than to have to spend time justifying, here's why I want to be allowed to the party as a tester. So there are some not just recruitment reasons, some not just what I described as structural reasons. There are some political and management reasons.
Okay, we have got time for one more thread, so we're going to go here to Curtis.
Thanks. How do your spheres of influence intersect with the concept of T-shaped people?
With the concept of what?
T-shaped people?
Oh, teaching people.
No, T-shaped.
T-shaped. T-shaped. Okay.
Tango shaped.
So this, if you will join me on a mission of the mind, is all of a sudden three-dimensional. It has a depth aspect, right? This is a difficult journey of the mind, so I'm sorry if I'm being a terrible tour guide. But imagine that this thing is the flat surface of a table, and each of these has sort of a conal shape where it narrows down. I see the T-shaped people thing as the T is on the surface area of this. The contributory, I'm trying to motion with something you can't see. The contributory expertise is, one, not composed of what a single individual provides, and two, deeper, maybe the stem. And the interactional expertise is the attenuated arms of the T. But they still, they overlap. They do that group hug thing. However, I think that it's more of a cone than a T, generally, for me. That as you get closer to your center of expertise, you have this angle. And as that top part grows, it sort of necessarily drags out the edges of what you're deep on, too. Because all of these things are deeply interconnected in these complex systems. So I would say one of the reasons this agrees with that T-shaped model is that if you want to create a system where people are invited and in fact required in order to succeed to be this large, to cover this much area within their role instead of being very tightly focused experts, you're going to have a variety of people, and they're going to need to both be T-shaped and willing to grow that portfolio of skill.
That is an awesome place to stop. Thank you very much, Jesse.